So I've been meaning to do this for a little while. Now I haven't been able to check and I haven't been able to see all the uniques. But I wanted to give an overview of like some uniques in the game versus other uniques that are in the game. Uh, they made a lot of changes to uniques in terms of what they do, and I think that some of these changes are good and some of these changes are quite bad. So I have in my inventory, I have a list of things I wanted to compare just to give you some examples of, I think the developers made some good buffs, I think the developers have made some bad nerfs, and I think they've made some lateral changes. And honestly, the lateral changes are the most interesting to me. First of all, I want to start with the good. Um, in terms of some uniques getting so much more extra value added to them, there's some uniques in the game that just got flat buffs across the board. Example number one to me is Tuskhelm of Yorgits the Mighty. This unique before was relatively mid. Its best stat on it was plus to aggressive resistance, which was damage reduction while berserking. The rest of its stats on it really weren't that great. Now it actually has good stats on it. It has maximum life, and it has things that actually interact with berserking. Getting movement speed, damage, and attack speed while berserking is all very good, especially because you can enable an infinite berserking build as of right now. However, I think the biggest problem that you have with Tuskhelm is the fact that it's really only going to fit into one build, which is infinite berserking. Any build that's not infinite berserking isn't using Tuskhelm. Outside of that, I do think it's a very good and a very useful unique to have, and I love the stat changes that they gave to it. Another one that I want to talk about here is Blood Artisan Cuirass. They removed the Blood Orbs bonus healing, and they replace it with Blood Orbs restoring essence. This is huge for a build that wants to be picking up Blood Orbs in order to fund its one-shot nuke. And in addition to that, the damage bonus after picking up a Blood Orb got buffed up even further, incentivizing the player to pick this up. They essentially gave you a legendary power for free onto a unique aspect, and I think this is a really good aspect that got tweaked up a major degree with just a small one-line dialogue of change, so to speak. Another example of something getting massively buffed is Waxing Gibbous. Waxing Gibbous was a unique that basically only saw play in certain shred builds. First off, the buff that they gave it, going from 2.5 to 4 seconds of guaranteed critical strikes, was a huge win for the weapon overall. However, the second ability that I needed to mention is the stat changes on it. That was just so good. Bonus critical strike damage that it can roll. Blood Howl giving you stealth, which again, breaking stealth guarantees critical strikes. Bonus ranks to shred. These were things that were not on this unique in the first place that have actually made Waxing Gibbous into a potentially viable strategy. I actually scrapped my old copy of Waxing Gibbous, like I did my old copy of Yorgets, just because they weren't worth running anymore. Now, something I want to talk about, which is kind of mid, is the new Frostburn. The new Frostburn gives you attack speed, which they want to do a lot of. They think attack speed is really good. I don't necessarily think that. The fire and cold damage is nice, and both lucky hit 40% chances to deal flat fire and cold damage. I get where they're going with that, but to be honest, that should have been one stat, and you could have had something else on here, as opposed to having 2 lucky hit chances in order to do it. The boosted effect of the lucky hit chance to freeze is good and could make it see play in Shatter Infinite Freeze decks, but a majority of the time you're still not going to run it. If you're running a lucky hit build, you're already going to be running Fist of Fate anyways. I really think that this is a unique that could have used a little bit more love into it. It's better than it was before, but not by much. Talk about that another time. I think those are fine. Flicker Step is another one to me that's interesting because they did buff it, but I don't feel like they did anything to improve its actual standing in terms of you actually using this unique. So, the fact that it now has a resistance on it, and the fact that it has a nice chunk to ultimate damage on it is very nice, and also having the 2 inherents is good for the evades reduction and the movement speed. But there's 2 problems. 1, the movement speed is not very good. 2, this is really only going to see play in a build where you have to spam your ultimate. It's your only source of damage. Whether you're running something like triple Tidal Blood Wave, a Cataclysm spam build, it's still a very niche unique if they were planning on getting it into more generic widespread use. They didn't do a particularly great job of it. Some uniques received changes like Adria's Exorbitant Will. None of the actual stats on the gear changed. They just simply went up in their numbers. So this is a ring that previously had willpower, lucky hit, damage to close, and ultimate cooldown reduction. And it still has willpower, lucky hit, damage to close, ultimate cooldown reduction, just at better numbers. If this was something that you were already running, it got better. I have a build that runs this. And if it's not something you were previously running, then it got significantly worse, in your opinion, because nothing about it made it unique and made you want to run it. Other examples of things that I wanted to cover. I don't think I have one here. That's not insatiable. About some of the changes not necessarily being the greatest in the world. Number 1 is Pain Gouger Gauntlets losing the basic attack damage on it. I understand that they gave you plus ranks to basic skills, and they want you to run the plus ranks to basic skills instead. But Lucky Hit Chance to Stun doesn't need to be here. Lucky Hit Chance to Stun isn't very good in my opinion, and I think overall Pain Gougers got worse. It wasn't in the best place in the world, and they didn't do much to improve and or buff it. Some changes that got complete reworks that were fantastic include the new Hellhammer, getting chunky ranks to upheaval, chunky ranks to wall up, upheaval size built flat into it, and strength, and then changing the inherent to damage to burning enemies, meaning 2 Hellhammers is usually enough to kill just about anything, is a nice change to have, but it's not necessarily great. Another change to me that I want to talk about, this one right here, by the way, is an old Starfall Cornet with maximum life, cooldown, ranks to Meteor, and lucky hit chance. Maximum life getting changed off into Meteor size is a nice change, but given that Sorceress already has lackluster defensive options in terms of health and survivability, taking away one of the few tools that they had on pieces of gear is a bit problematic in my opinion. Some of the other changes here are nice. I think the new Banished Lord is good. Going to have the maximum life as a stat on there is very nice. The downside to me is I just feel like, once again, Banished Lord is a difficult unique to run because you can only run it based off of how it stats. So, for example, this one right here, which has good overpower, it's almost maximum overpower, maximum life, mid-of-the-road attack speed, and a greater affix core skill. And it's never going to see any play with me. You want to know why? Because the affix is only 40%, not 60%. I think that's kind of problematic, that this is still a problem that you have with uniques. You could have a god tier unique that has great stats on it, but you'll never run it because of the power. But overall, it's better than the original in my opinion. Conversely, oh, you know what? Let me take both of these for that. Conversely, another example of something getting worse through no fault of its own is Iragma's Magnum Opus. Now, this is the old one, but the reason why this has become terrible is because they changed the actual skill on it. Skills using this weapon deal increased damage per point of fury you have, but you lose 10 fury per second. The problem that you have with this is that this is just simply not good enough to see play, because you're not going to be able to maintain your Fury cost unless you have an insanely powerful build, to the point where I'm basically scrapping and salvaging every single one of these that I get just because of the fact that it's losing 10 Fury per second on a character that already has trouble with it. Another example as well to me is this one being the old Death Blow versus the new Death Blow. I have a triple greater affix Death Blow. Is it in here? No, it's on the character. I have a triple greater affix Death Blow that has damage to injured, physical, and plus ranks. It was masterworked all the way up to 12 out of 12, and it was about 50,000 attack power less than the new overkill that they introduced into the game. Which just goes to show you, in my opinion, that some of these changes don't look like they're good, but they actually ended up being good. So now we're on to the meat and potatoes of some of the comparisons that I wanted to do. These are some direct examples of me having an older unique versus me having a newer unique, and wanting to explain the difference in some of these uniques as to why I think some of the changes are good and some of the changes are bad. I also wanted to explain, most of these, by the way, are what I'm going to consider lateral changes, okay? All of these changes right here are replacing certain stats around that sometimes change how the weapon functions, or the piece of gear functions. Let's start with Earthbreaker. Earthbreaker is probably one of the better examples in terms of taking a unique and giving it a lateral change. So the old Earthbringer had two good stats on it, which was a high percent willpower and spirit cost reduction. This gives you more damage with your skills in particular, and this gives you the ability to spam your skills more often. A middling attack speed and a lucky hit chance to slow, which is mainly just for the crash stone aspect, so that you could do more damage to crowd-controlled enemies. This got replaced with Critical Strike Chance in place of Willpower, which in my opinion is a very good upgrade. Earth Attack Speed, basically being the same as regular attack speed, but just putting a condition on it. I didn't care about this either way. And then replacing the Spirit Cost with Chance for Landslide to cast twice, and the Lucky Hit with plus ranks to Landslide. In theory, this does make the weapon overall stronger. You are getting the chance for Landslide to cast twice Temper Manual on your ring, freeing up potentially a Temper Manual for your two-hander. Plus ranks to a skill you're actively using, and a high crit chance. The downside, and what makes this a lateral, is the fact that you lost the Spirit Cost reduction. By losing the Spirit Cost reduction, you've made it harder to spam the skill out. And since most of the build is just constantly spamming out landslides as much as humanly possible, that does become a slight problem. Another lateral change that I want to talk about that's not bad, in my opinion, is going to be Tebalt's Will. Tebalt's Will right now, this is the original Tebalt's Will right here, which had +3 to potion capacity. It's an underrated asset, but it can be helpful in certain situations. Plus the maximum resource. This one's more conditional depending on how much resource you actually find yourself needing. And if you're a cooldown-based build, this is kind of worthless. Plus the damage, which is always very good. And damage reduction from close enemies. This is a very good stat line. Even though it is situational, having damage reduction is always nice. And damage reduction from close enemies tends to be better compared to damage reduction from distant enemies. You're going to be closer more often than distant, and you're going to get one shot by most things that are distant anyways, like corpse bows off screen, so there's no real value in having damage reduction from distant because you're not getting saved there. The new one keeps the maximum resource, but replaces everything else. Damage gets replaced with maximum life. This can be seen as a buff or a nerf depending on what you were using Tebalt's Will for. Potion capacity gets replaced with all stat. In my opinion, that's a downside. If you didn't care about the potion capacity, which most players didn't, you could see that as a buff, because it's a useless stat getting turned into a good stat. In my opinion, though, I think it kind of was a good stat. damage reduction from close being changed to damage reduction while unstoppable. This to me is the big nerf that makes it a lateral in my opinion. They tried to make it more of a tanky option by trading damage for health and damage reduction while close to damage reduction while unstoppable. The problem is that very few builds can actually take advantage of that damage reduction while unstoppable. The most noticeable being Barbarians with Rallying Cry and the extra duration on Shouts. This basically will give you 7.5 seconds of damage reduction, which is fine and dandy. However, most classes can't take advantage of it in any other way. Druid, which is what I'm on right now, has Earthen Bulwark, which only lasts for 5 seconds. You can get up to a few more, but you have to waste another aspect slot. Or, how about for Sorceress? You get the damage reduction while you're in Deep Freeze, but you're damage immune already while you're in Deep Freeze. You can get the damage reduction while you're in Teleport, but you're already damage immune while you're in Teleport. You can get the damage reduction while in Flame Shield, but you already get complete damage immunity in Flame Shield. Which means the only thing that you could use this on a Sorceress is for Ice Armor. And Ice Armor requires you to run an aspect to become unstoppable. Very similar to Barbarians with Iron Skin. Same thing. The damage reduction while unstoppable for Necromancer is only going to be benefiting Blood Mist. And you're already damage immune. This to me feels like an unneeded nerf to it, because that entire stat line is basically worthless to you. You're still going to be using these pants for their intended effect, which is strictly going to be for the new effect on it. Now, another example of something would be Insatiable Fury. The old Insatiable Fury had one missing stat on it that sucked, which was not having maximum life. Damage reduction while fortified was okay. Physical damage benefited your Pulverize. Total armor in Werebear form made it so you didn't have to run any other armor with your gear and you were good. And overpower damage made it so that your Pulverizes hit harder. With the change now, you have maximum life, Werebear overpower, bonus to Ursane strength, and bonuses to Iron Fur. This is a positive change across the board. So why am I putting this in the lateral category? Well, let's talk about this. First of all, while the maximum life gain is nice, and it being a % maximum life, this significantly makes you chunkier overall as a Werebear, which is also increasing your Pulverize and overpower damage. However, the trade-off comes in the form of armor. I remember when I first equipped the new one over the old one, my armor in Werebear form went from about 11k, which was overcapped, down to about, I think it was like, what? 6.8k? Maybe 7k? Right around 7k. And I didn't have anywhere in my gear that I could actually buff my armor back up. I actually didn't get back my old armor until I got a Shaco to drop. So that is a bit of a downside, because the maximum life did nothing to me, because by not being at the armor cap, it limited what I could safely challenge by not being at the armor cap. Werebear overpower and regular overpower is interchangeable and fine. The losing of the physical damage and the damage reduction while fortified, I'm okay with. They were lower rolls to begin with, and what they got replaced with is Rankster Iron Fur, which is damage reduction in Werebear form flat, and Rankster Ursane Strength, which is more maximum health and more overpower damage while healthy in Werebear form. Both of these are unique changes, and I do like it. This is one of the rare cases of me bitching about a minor category that affected me. I know, that's so rare, right? But I do feel like it's worth mentioning that that drop in total armor is significantly noticeable if you're not expecting it. So, as we're running through the list, now we should talk about some changes that are either direct nerfs or are negative lateral changes, in my opinion. The first one I want to start with is Azure Wrath. The old Azure Wrath is an okay weapon. It's difficult to slot it into most builds, but it's okay nonetheless. Lucky hit chance to freeze and deal a chunk of cold damage is kind of mid, especially because it's only an up to 20% chance. So call it 20% chance. Which made it a little bit of a weaker lucky hit. Although, to be fair, the stats on the weapon are pretty good. Core skill damage, non-physical damage, damage to crowd control, and attack speed. For barbarians, this synergized really well with Hellhammer, because you could stun off of Hellhammer. For the crowd control, the non-physical damage was good for the burn on it, and the freeze was also good for applying crowd control. Now the new weapon, however, has changed and is no longer an enabler for other forms of damage. Losing the core damage and the damage to crowd control really sucks, in my opinion. This basically lost all of its damage. No, I'm not exaggerating. This weapon essentially lost all of its damage. It is now more of a defensive item. So let me explain. This weapon previously had 3 additive damage multipliers. Now, additive damage isn't as good as multiplicative damage, obviously. However, you did have 3 separate choices. Core, crowd control, non-physical. This meant that you could run this on Shadow Necromancers because of the non-physical. You could run this on any crowd control build, although you wouldn't get great effect, and any core scale build. All of those stats were replaced with defensive, lucky hit stats. You have a lucky hit 40% chance to deal cold damage. Okay? And by the way, the lucky hit chance is higher than the lucky hit on the main weapon, but is lower damage overall. Why that was included makes seemingly no sense to me, because you already have a roll on there. Then, you're getting all stat. Kind of worthless, but okay, I guess. It kept the attack speed, which honestly I'm fine with, and then it gets cold resistance. The problem with this is that you don't want a resistance on a weapon. If you do, you're better off just running an Uber like a Staff of Lycander, or hell, even a new Tacit of the Dawning Skies a little bit better. This is just overall a downgrade. It's a lateral because it's not a direct nerf. You're losing additive damage and getting more defensive and lucky hit based. In theory, this is fine. In practice, it kind of sucks because of the fact that you're not really benefiting too much anymore. Another lateral change that I want to cover is G-Falls. Now, G-Falls only had... Oh. Why are they both vulnerable? Hold on. Ah, there we go. I'm like, what the hell? Alright. Alright, there we go. So, G-Falls had a little bit of a change done to it. Basically, the only stat that changed is they swapped out cooldown reduction in favor of vulnerable damage. All of the other stats got buffed up. All stat, lucky hit, and damage over time are still there. And all of those are relatively okay. Lucky hit chance is good because its effect is a lucky hit chance. All stats okay. It didn't get changed, so it doesn't matter. Damage over time is good because it's playing in damage over time builds. So what's the problem? Cooldown reduction benefited you more than vulnerable damage. The change to vulnerable damage to me feels as though if it was to synergize with particular builds. For example, bleed build barbarians often use vulnerable as a secondary damage bucket to take advantage of. Blight necromancers will often use vulnerable as a secondary damage type. Rogues love vulnerable damage, even if they don't plan on using vulnerable damage. But to me, I think part of the problem is it takes away a little bit of the versatility. See, poison and fire don't really take advantage of vulnerable damage. So, poison build druids got no value from this, whereas cooldown reduction was helpful for their skills. Fire build druids, again, are getting no value, or fire build sorcerers, sorry, are getting no value from this, whereas they would from the cooldown reduction. This, to me, creates a small problem because of the fact that you're just not getting the same benefits anymore that you would out of previous copies of G-Falls. Another change to talk about here is going to be Ancient's Oath. Now, Ancient's Oath is never really a good unique. The problem is just that it's competing with a Grandfather, and ultimately a Grandfather is going to be better overall. Steel Grasp isn't really that widely ran because it's not that good. The old Steel Grasp gave you vulnerable damage, which Steel Grasp automatically applies vulnerable. Damage to close, which it pulls enemies in. Damage while berserking, which is situational if you grab that upgrade. And plus ranks to Steel Grasp. Even though its legendary effect is relatively good, where basically enemies hit take bonus damage from you, the change to it overall does make it stronger, but it also takes away a couple of categories I don't like. See, you lose the second category of vulnerable damage, and you're losing the damage while berserking. Now, removing two situational categories is fine. The problem is this weapon didn't really get anything that makes it better. Cooldown reduction is nice because that helped with all of your skills, not just Ancient's Oath. But the big chunk to damage to close and strength is supposed to make it to where you pull enemies in and just blow them up. The problem that I realistically have with this weapon, though, is still this. It's competing with a two-handed slasher and a Grandfather. This works better to me if it was in the one-handed slot as opposed to the two-handed slot. Even though they added some buffs to the weapon, a Berserking Barbarian is still going to get less value out of this than they would a two-hander, where they could put their own stats on it, like a two-handed legendary. So I think that this, in total, could use a little bit more of a buff. I don't think it's in the healthiest state right now. That's going to then bring me to these bad boys. These are examples of just straight-up nerfs. Now, the hardest nerf to cover is probably going to be the Tempest Roar. So, the old Tempest Roar gives you an interesting package. First of all, it's designed to be used with a shapeshifter. So the damage while shapeshifted is good. It's designed to be used in crit builds, so the crit damage is good. Maximum Spirit is okay, not really anything to sing home about. And Poison Resist is a relatively weak resistance, but it did synergize with the old Mad Wolf's Glee. Since Mad Wolf's Glee got reworked and no longer has the poison stuff on it, which, admittedly, thank God, they reworked the new one. Now, the maximum resource is basically maximum spirit. Don't pay attention to that, it's fine, same as before. The lightning res from poison res is, once again, fine. It's a resistance on a unique. That's always helpful because resistances can be hard to do if you are in a unique heavy build. However, the other two changes are absolutely terrible in my opinion. First of all, critical strike damage and damage while shapeshifted are nice damage bonuses to have because of the build you were playing. Now, you have willpower, which, okay, willpower is a nice flat change. And then you have plus ranks to wild impulses, which, if I remember correctly... Don't tell me it's this one. Wild impulses being core skills cost more, but deal more damage. This is really not a good buff, in my opinion, to Tempest Roar. It's really not. You're losing granted situational damage categories, but situational damage categories that you were previously using in favor of categories that are incredibly generic and bland. This, to me, is a huge downgrade to the unique overall. The last two nerfs, by the way, are... Ooh, hold on a minute. I might have to make a trade. So the last two uniques to cover here are just straight downgrades. Butcher Cleaver before had critical strike, physical, crowd control, and crit against injured. Take away crit against injured for a minute. Crit damage, physical damage, and crowd controlled all synergize with how the build worked. It was a lucky hit. When you crit an enemy, you crowd controlled them. All three of those added together. The problem that you have with the new one, you're getting attack speed and movement speed in place of two of those categories, which means no crit, and that means no crowd control damage. Now, the attack speed could be good. The movement speed is not. Yes, you buff physical damage. Yes, you buff critical strike chance against feared. But the weapon overall got a nerf. Just because of the fact that, once again, they took away certain conditional additive categories. Last up, you have Mother's Embrace, which was widely regarded as one of the worst uniques in the game that saw little to no play. You got critical strike damage, lucky hit chance, maximum life, and all stat. For an early game unique, to give you maximum life was pretty good. Most rings didn't give you maximum life in a unique. All stat and lucky hit are kind of meh, and crit damage is always nice. The new one, however, replaces crit damage with critical strike chance. This is making you more consistent with critting, but less damage overall. And by giving you attack speed in place of maximum life, it's more of a damage-oriented option that realistically, to me, is just worthless. They've made it even worse. So, overall, I think the major problem that you have with the uniques that they introduced is the fact that the uniques really just need to see some play. Some more love and rework. Otherwise, I think the game's not in a good spot.